This season of Trucksafe Live is presented by LogRock. LogRock builds technology tools to help trucking companies stay compliant with federal and state regulations. LogRock is easier. We connect to multiple systems like your FMCSA account and ELD, so you only have to use one system. LogRock is faster. We automate tedious tasks so you can use your time more effectively. LogRock is smarter. We notify you of issues like expiring or missing documents before they happen, so you can be proactive rather than reactive. Setup is easy, and most of our customers are online shortly after signing up. Request a demo now at logrock.com.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode 25 of Trucksafe Live, show where we and our guests tackle the hot button issues impacting highway transportation. I'm Brandon with Trucksafe and Childress Law, both of which are dedicated to helping motor carriers develop and maintain cutting-edge safety programs. Excited to be here with you today. Thanks everybody for joining us. If you're here live with us, say hey in the comments. Just so we see who's here with us. And as we go along, as always, if you have any questions about what we're talking about, feel free to throw it in the comments and we'll get it as they come up. I think today's topic will be a good one for that type of interaction. So hopefully you have all of your questions ready. Today we're talking about CSA and SMS and ISS and SFDs and whatever other acronyms the DOT has created. Safety metrics, fleet safety metrics, what they mean, how they are calculated, what they are saying about your fleet, and most importantly, what you can do and what you should do to improve those various metrics and keep yourselves out of the crosshairs. So looking forward to that discussion. I've got Rob Carpenter back with me today from Carpenter Compliance, so should be a great show. Before we get to that topic, though, a few things going on. Number one, a couple things Trucksafe related. I've mentioned this in prior shows, but first up, our Trucksafe Fleet Compliance Boot Camp is coming up. This will be the second one that we've done. This is our in-person 2-day conference for fleet safety professionals to gather together, a small group of us. Our next one's going to be in Orlando, Florida, October 12th and 13th, the Rosen Plaza Hotel nearby Walt Disney World and Universal Studios. We're going to gather together, like I said, a group of about 50 or so of us, and really get into the nitty-gritty of DOT compliance. Various sessions planned on all kinds of topics: driver qualification, hours of service, vehicle maintenance, drug and alcohol testing. I got some great guest speakers lined up. I've got a reception planned, drinks and live music. So if nothing else, maybe join us for that. So if you're interested in joining us for that, check it out over at trucksafebootcamp.com. Registration is now open. Seats are filling up quick. We're well over halfway there now already, and we've still got a couple of months to go here. So if you're interested, get in there, trucksafebootcamp.com. Register sooner rather than later, and we will see you there. Also wanted to mention, as always, our Trucksafe Fleet Compliance Network. If you're not a member of this, I'd recommend you join it. It's free to join. Trucksafenetwork.com, or download the free Trucksafe app on the App Store or the Google Play Store. Trucksafe Network is a social network for fleet safety professionals to gather together, learn from one another, ask questions, and also have access to all of our content, our videos on various DOT compliance topics, our detailed articles, our podcast, and much more. So would love to have you there. Check that out if you haven't already, trucksafenetwork.com. All right. Last thing I'll mention about Trucksafe is if you missed the last show, we had a show a couple weeks ago. We were joined by Mike Preche from Fleetworthy, CEO of Fleetworthy. We had a great discussion on an interesting topic about regulatory overreach. What happens, or how do we know when regulations go too far, and what should we do about it as an industry when the regulations go too far? It was kind of based on an article that we had published on our website a few weeks ago. So you can check that out on our website, trucksafe.com, and then catch the last show wherever you get your podcast, Spotify, Apple Podcast, or YouTube, wherever. Check that out if you're interested. Okay, enough about us. What's going on in the industry? A few things here before we get into today's topic. This is something we published on our website last week. The Pipeline and Hazardous Material Safety Administration, PHMSA, which is responsible for the hazmat regulations, proposing those and rolling them out for all modes of transportation, not just motor carriers, but also, pipeline, as its name would imply, pipelines, railroads, vessels. They publish the hazmat regs. But anyway, they came out with a proposed rule. Actually, it was an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. So this is a notice to the public that PHMSA is contemplating pretty significant changes to its hazmat rules. I think there were 46 or so proposals in that notice. We broke it all down on an article that we published on our website, trucksafe.com, last week. A lot of various topics, including training for hazmat employees, changes to that process potentially, changes to certification process for people for folks that are inspecting hazmat tanks. So there's a lot that they are proposing. If you're interested in that, if it affects you, then go check it out over at trucksafe.com. It's our latest article. You may also want to subscribe to our newsletter over at trucksafe.com/subscribe, where we are pushing out our newsletter where we highlight all of this kind of breaking regulatory news. The last thing I'll mention, kind of industry updates, is a proposal that was a proposed rule that was filed a couple of weeks ago. It's a joint rulemaking between FMCSA and National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, that would, if it goes through in final form, mandate automatic emergency braking technology on heavy trucks, which they define in that rule to mean anything over 10,000 pounds. And if it takes effect, which I have no reason to believe that it won't, it would be a phase-in schedule where I think the first trucks that would be required to be manufactured with that technology, it would be like 4 years from the date of the publication of the final rule, and that would be for the heavier trucks over 26,000 pounds. And then the trucks between 10,000 pounds and 26,000 pounds, it looked like would get an extra year. But that would be a rule that would apply to newly manufactured vehicles as of those dates. As it stands now, there would be no retrofitting requirement. So again, another topic that we have a detailed article on over at trucksafe.com if you're interested. So that's kind of what's going on in the industry. Let's move then to the topic of today. So as I said, we're talking about the importance of tracking and reining in various compliance metrics if you're a regulated fleet. This summer, Jared and I have been on kind of a tour of the United States, visiting with a number of regulated fleets, our clients, to help them with mock DOT audits. And one of the things that we spend a lot of time talking with them about are their fleet safety metrics, and helping them understand what those metrics are saying about them and where things may be going wrong for them. These metrics, as I said, include things like CSA scores, out of service rates, ISS scores, accident rates, and more. And they are fertile ground for the FMCSA and the plaintiffs bar when it comes to targeting motor carriers for enforcement or crucifying them in a highway accident, litigation stemming from a highway accident. So it's critical that all motor carriers, all regulated carriers, understand, number one, what compliance data is out there about their fleet, how it's calculated, what it says about them, and most importantly, as I said, how to improve it. So with me today is Rob Carpenter of Carpenter Compliance to help me break it all down. Welcome back, Rob.
Hey, how are you?
Doing all right. You're in Orlando today, no?
I am. The background's a little different. So it's hot, it's nasty, it's soupy. So other than that, it's good. I almost wore my my Lilo and Stitch Disney button up, but
where's your mouse ears, Rob?
I almost did it. My wife told me I needed more personality in the show, so I almost threw it together.
Yeah, we're big Disney fans here in the Wiseman household. My oldest son's name is Walter, named after Walt Disney. So you would have been right at home here with your mouse ears had you worn them today. So anyway, I'm going to be down there with you here in the miserable heat here in a few days. I'm coming down. We're going to be meeting with a client together and looking forward to it. But thanks in the meantime for joining me today. Really appreciate it. Always interested in your perspective on these types of topics. Little background for those who don't know Rob Carpenter. Maybe just give us your quick background.
So a little snippet, so we don't spend all day. But I started as a driver. Basically, went into brokering freight from being a driver, and then went into owning a company, small carrier management, medium-sized management, and enterprise carrier management of all modes: household goods, freight, passenger, even a little hazmat. So that's generally how it's been historically. And now I run Carpenter Compliance, which is a consulting firm, basically focusing on helping motor carriers and other customers like private equity groups do due diligence and build defensive-based programs focused on compliance and exposure. So that's the short version.
Yeah, any fleet safety professionals out there, you would do yourself a favor if you follow Rob on LinkedIn. He's always posting a lot of great content on compliance issues, really insightful uh, uh, articles on that type of stuff. So check him out over at LinkedIn. Glad to have him as a good friend, and certainly helps our clients quite a bit. So yeah, today, Rob, we're talking about fleet safety metrics. You, like us, are constantly out there looking at these metrics, and we understand them. Obviously, it's kind of our job to be looking at these metrics for fleets, but and I'm sure this is true with you as well. I've found that not enough fleets really understand what goes into these metrics and what they're saying about their particular operations. So I thought it would be useful for us to spend some time walking through what we view as the most important metrics, kind of how they're calculated, basically. We're not going to get into the entire methodology for some of these things. If you print out the methodology for CSA scores, for example, it's like a couple hundred pages. So we're going to hit the high points here, but sound good to you?
It does.
All right.
Something we all need. So
yeah, and like I said at the start, I want this to be an interactive show. We got lots of people on with us today, so if you've got questions as we go along about these things and how they work, throw it in the comments, and we'll bring it up and talk about it. We've already got a couple of comments here. Let's take a look here. The go-getters here with the questions coming in early. I have an employee who has a CDL that has an intra-state restriction on his license. The motor vehicle report says he's not required to have a DOT physical. Is that correct? I've never seen this. No, that's not correct. It's correct for CDL drivers that they don't have to report the status of their medical exams to their state licensing agency. So that's probably why you see that notice on their MVR. I presume it's not a CDL driver. Oh, you know what? It could also be the issue with intrastate. Rob, you want to go through kind of the difference for exempt and non-exempt drivers?
Yeah. So what happens in these cases is I guess back in 2012, what happened is FMCSA started requiring CDL drivers to self-certify with their respective DMV, whatever state they're licensed in with their CDL. And what you're required to do is provide a copy of your medical certification with a form for that specific state that says how you operate. So when I say how you operate, it could be, in this case, it sounds like you're an interstate carrier. And in that case, your driver should be what we call non-accepted interstate, or NI is sometimes what it says on the MVR. But what happens is sometimes drivers will go to the DMV and they won't self-certify in the right way. So they'll certify themselves as an intrastate exempt driver, CDL driver. And that means technically that driver could have a CDL forever and never need a med cert filed with the DMV because they're saying that they only operate intrastate, so they're exempt from med card requirements. So what has to happen here is when you're reviewing MVRs, a lot of people just check expiration and what kind of license they have, but you also need to think about how you operate as a carrier, because if you're an interstate carrier, you have to check that medical status on the MVR to make sure that they've self-certified with their DMV not only that they've done it, but that they've done it in the right way. And in your case, it sounds like your driver chose the wrong self-certification. So in an audit, if he gets chosen as one of your sample drivers, it would be an issue with you
Yeah.
being an interstate carrier.
Yeah, and to be clear, that exemption for intrastate drivers is really only an exemption from them having to file proof of their medical exam with their state licensing agency. It's not an all-encompassing exemption from the medical requirement altogether. If you look at a truly intrastate driver, every state in the country has adopted some version of the federal rules for intrastate drivers, and virtually all of them, I think all of them, because I think this is one of the required things that they have to do to be part of the federal MCSAP program. They have adopted a physical exam requirement for the drivers that are operating intrastate in their state. So even if this driver is truly an intrastate driver, he's very well potentially subject to the medical exam requirement, has to have a medical card. Maybe he just doesn't have to file it with his state. And so maybe that's what the exemption is telling you. But if he's operating a commercial motor vehicle for you as a regulated fleet, whether it's interstate or intrastate commerce, if he is operating a regulated vehicle, he's going to have a medical card. And you need to get a copy of it. And he, like Rob said, he may need to change his certification status on his with his state licensing agency, depending on how you intend for him to operate. All right. Thanks for the question, Gina. See, we got one more here. Let's see what we got. Charlotte's asking, do sales team member pickups need to be DOT? What is the pros cons of IRP tags if under the required weight? Wow, these are some lofty questions. But important ones. Sales team member pickups. I'm not sure what they mean by that. Do you know, Rob?
I'm thinking that it's probably going to go. I'm thinking without having more information. I'm thinking that they're probably talking about maybe the salesman exemption from some regulations. That's the only thing I can think of.
Yeah,
because sometimes you're exempt from certain things like hours of service under short haul. You can leave one place and not have to return to the same place. I think we would need more information on that question.
Yeah, if that's true, if that's the question, Charlotte, you've got traveling salesmen. Classic example are going to be like beverage drivers. They are delivering beverages, Coke or Pepsi, to a retail facility, but they are also salespeople. They are selling. And there is a specific exemption, as Rob mentioned, for those types of folks from the hours of service rule specifically, but it's an hours of service exemption for those members. It's not an exemption from anything else. So for those, if that's who you're talking about, they are still going to be subject to other DOT requirements like the medical exam requirement and the driver qualification requirement, stuff like that. And then on your question about IRP tags, man, we could spend probably an hour talking about this. As you said, Charlotte, there's a weight limit or a weight threshold that mandates IRP tags. If you have vehicles that weigh over 26,000 pounds, power units that are operating in interstate commerce, they have to have IRP tags. If they're under 26,000 pounds, 26,001 pounds, then they are not mandated to have IRP tags, but you can voluntarily get IRP tags. And so your question is, what are the pros and cons of having IRP tags when the vehicles are under that weight? From my perspective, and then I'll let Rob weigh in. The pros, let me start with the cons. So the cons are, as I understand it, the IRP tags are going to be more expensive than state-based plates for those vehicles. So you're going to be paying more for those tags. The pros are, if you put IRP tags on those vehicles, then you get some benefits in terms of federal preemption of state registration fees. There is a whole document out there, I forget what it's called. It's the IRP manual or whatever. The states that subscribe to IRP have come together in a kind of a compact of states, and they have agreed to give reciprocity to the vehicles that are licensed under the program. And the benefit you get out of the IRP plates is that if you are paying fees into IRP, then you're going to be exempt from certain state-specific registration fees that you may have had to pay otherwise. Whereas if you have state-based plates, you're not going to be exempt from those requirements. So that's my take on it. Rob, you got anything else to add to that?
I don't have anything else to add, but it looks like she added some more context to the question. Sales guys that don't deliver products but driving company pickup. I'm thinking we're going in the merchandiser where your guy goes into the store every day and fronts all the beer or the bread or whatever they're doing. But if it's just a pickup truck, I don't necessarily think that you have any more benefit than what you already said.
Yeah. Depends on the
So
weight of the truck. That's really what it comes down to, and whether they're operating in interstate or intrastate commerce. That's really the two things that you have to look at as to whether the DOT regulations require. You're asking now about the DOT number on the side of the vehicle. Depends on the weight of the vehicle and whether it's moving in interstate or intrastate commerce. If it's moving in interstate commerce and it weighs less than 10,000 pounds, 10,001 pounds or less, 10,000 pounds or less, then you're not going to be subject to any DOT requirements. You don't have to put the DOT number on it, etc. But if it's 10,001 pounds or more, either by itself or if you've got a trailer on the back that causes the combination to exceed 10,000 pounds, then you do have to have the DOT number on the side of it, for example. And that changes a little bit if you're only staying within a state. Each state has, like I said, kind of adopted certain version of the federal rules, and some of them change that weight threshold. So, for example, there are some states that raise it up to 26,000 pounds. So if you stay within the state and are only operating in intrastate commerce and your vehicle weighs less than 26,001 pounds, then in that particular state, then you may not have to have the DOT number. But others keep it at that 10,000 pound threshold. So if that's you, if you're operating intrastate, you need to know how your particular state has adopted the federal rules. All right. Enough free legal advice, people. Let's move on to today's topic, which again is safety metrics. Rob, I wanted to kind of start things off by talking about why these fleet safety metrics that we're going to talk about are important. I don't think enough folks know who exactly is looking at these scores and what the implications are. So maybe we could start with why the scores are important in your view, the various scores, whether we're talking about CSA scores or out of service rates or ISS scores. Why are these things important in your view?
Well, there's a lot of these things that come up, and from when I was a broker, obviously brokers look at these things, and that's a big one for carriers who need brokers to find their work for them. Because one of the first things they look at when they send you the carrier pack, if you're bidding on their load, is they want to make sure that you're a legitimate carrier and that your safety scores are good. Typically, if you're a conditional or unsatisfactory carrier, they're not going to let you haul their freight. So that's a big piece of it if you're relying on brokers to find your work. So that's the first piece. But if, I posted something on LinkedIn a couple of hours ago about a carrier that I worked with who does a lot of closed loop passenger transportation and motor coaches. And what happens when they put out these RFPs for you to bid on them to get that closed loop contract that could be millions of dollars over 10 years or 5 years or whatever. They're going to look at your safety scores and your out of service ratings and your accident rating and all these things to make sure that you're a safe motor carrier typically. And then the other piece of that is obviously insurers check these. Underwriters want to see them. And, Brandon and I were talking last week because we have a mutual friend who's an insurance broker who called and said, "Hey, I've got this guy," and it was just an unfortunate instance. He had a small fleet, and because he had like 2 violations of out of service, his out of service rate went up to like 50% and made him uninsurable. So all of those things, are there for people to see publicly, and then you have customers. I mean, if you have a shipper that's going to hire you directly, they can check these things. Or if you're a fare-based passenger carrier, they have the ability to check these to decide if they're going to ride with you or ride with someone else. So it covers all modes of transportation and a broad number of effects on your bottom line and ability to operate.
Yeah, and if you think about it, it makes sense that your customers care about this stuff because we are seeing more and more instances of shippers and brokers being pulled into highway accident litigation when you go out and get involved in an accident. Plaintiffs' attorneys are always looking for the deep pockets. That's the way it is. And if you've only got $1 million of commercial auto liability insurance, you're not the deep pocket. But
Yeah.
you may have a broker involved or a shipper involved. If you're hauling for a well-known shipper, a multi-million dollar business, they are the deep pocket. So they're going to get pulled into that litigation. And we are seeing this theory of liability that is negligent hiring, negligent selection type theory of liability, where the plaintiff argues that you as the broker or you as the shipper had a legal duty to use reasonable care in selecting the motor carriers that you use to haul freight, and you breached that duty by picking a motor carrier whose safety metrics should have tipped you off to the fact that maybe there's problems with this carrier. Then the argument is that you're negligent in selecting that motor carrier, and because of your negligence, but for your negligence, the accident wouldn't have happened because you would have not put that carrier out on the road. That's the theory that's put forth to the jury, and that is catching on. It is persuasive to a lot of juries, and so brokers and shippers have real skin in the game here. They are potentially exposed to these types of multi-million-dollar verdicts when the motor carrier that they use goes and gets involved in a serious accident. So because of that, you are seeing more and more brokers and shippers spend more time on this stuff. It's always been the case, not always, but it's been the case for a long time where you would see, it's common to see in a shipper or broker agreement with a motor carrier that they don't do business with a carrier that has a safety rating that's less than satisfactory. So conditionally rated carriers and certainly unsat carriers are not going to qualify. But it hasn't always been the case that they take it the next step and start to dig into your your CSA scores and stuff like that. And you are seeing that more and more frequently nowadays, has been my experience.
Yeah. And you got, it used to be you had contingent cargo, and you could get contingent cargo for brokers. Really, it was cheap insurance. I mean, everybody could get it because it was relatively inexpensive, and now it's somewhat outrageous compared to what it was in the 2000s. Simply because this idea has caught on that, hey, we'll go after the broker if something happens with our cargo while it's with the carrier that they chose. And then you have the same thing with shippers. I had a client. It's one of the biggest oil companies in Texas, and they had no hand in this accident. That they hired a trucking company. They used their truck, their trailer, their driver, and the only thing that tied this oil company to this accident was their oil was in this truck's tank. And when they ran into a family and killed them and had hours of service violations, the first thing that they did was draw that oil company into that lawsuit. So it happens, and
if you're in the lawsuit, you've already lost, because it's going to cost you time and money to get out of that case, and you're going to end up paying a hefty fee to do that. So, yeah, I mean, certainly, as you said, customers are a big stakeholder when it comes to these metrics. They are looking at them. You mentioned commercial auto liability insurers using it to help set your premiums. And then certainly plaintiff's bar is going to be looking at it. If you get involved in an accident, that's one of the first things they're going to ask for or look for are, what do your CSA scores look like? What do your out of services percentages look like? And you could see where they're going with it. We've talked about this on other shows when we're talking about nuclear verdicts. The cases that end up with those types of multi-million-dollar and now billion-dollar jury verdicts, the case quickly becomes less about the circumstances of that particular accident and more about the reputation of the motor carrier whose driver was involved in it. The story that's told to the jury is not focused on what happened in this particular accident. It's focused on casting the motor carrier as a bad actor, as demonstrated by their poor safety performance. And then that's what inflames the jury and gets them mad at the motor carrier and makes them want to punish that motor carrier for having trucks out on the road to begin with. And that's where you see those multi-million-dollar jury verdicts awarded, are in cases where a motor carrier's safety metrics paint a bad picture about their efforts to comply with safety regulations. So, commercial insurers, customers, plaintiffs' bar, certainly the FMCSA, whose systems these are, there are lots of people looking at your scores. If you're not looking at them as the regulated motor carrier, you stand no chance, because all these other people are looking at them. You have to know what your scores say about you in order to get them in a place where they're not causing you problems in these other contexts.
Yeah.
So there's a few different big metrics that from my perspective, are ones that all fleets should be paying attention to. And, I think it makes sense to go through them. First one I want to talk about are kind of out of service rates. Rob, you want to kind of go through what those are, how they're calculated, what they mean, essentially?
Yeah, so you've got out of service rates, and usually this is one of the first things that I look at because when you open, when you're in Safer and you're looking at a company snapshot, one of the first things that come up is going to be the out of service rate, and it's going to start with vehicle, driver, hazmat, etc. So it can be kind of skewed, kind of like what I talked about earlier with our broker friend, and basically there's a set percentage for each for driver out of service percentages you get, the more out of service you get, the more your percentage is going to go up. And this looks back 24 months. So of course this is going to improve because is going to be some data that falls off after it, is older than 24 months. So that's generally what I look at first, and then I kind of work down from there. But that's going to be the first thing you see.
You mentioned Safer, and so I went ahead and pulled it up here just in an example carrier. Like Rob said, this is publicly available information. So this is the FMCSA Safer website. Anybody can access this. You can search for any regulated motor carrier by name or DOT number. I just pulled up a random one here. Sorry, JNB Transport, if you're watching. Not calling you out here. But your scores look decent. Not terrible. So, but anyway, this is the screen that you would be taken to if you were to search any regulated carrier. You would see their basic registration details up at the top, how many power units they are operating, how many drivers they have, what type of freight they're hauling, whether they're interstate or intrastate. And then the section that's right below that are the out of service rates. As Rob mentioned, how frequently are your vehicles or drivers being placed out of service for serious safety violations as compared to the number of times that your vehicles or drivers have been stopped for an inspection. So if you've been stopped 100 times and 50 of those times your drivers have been prohibited from continuing to operate because of a serious violation, that would be a 50% out of service rate. And like Rob said, it's based on 24 months worth of data. So anybody can see this. You can see here in this example, a little hard to tell. Sorry for the small numbers here, but it's broken out into vehicle, driver, hazmat out of services, and then intermodal equipment providers if you're a chassis provider or anything like that. But the important ones here are vehicle, driver, and hazmat if you haul it. You can see here this particular carrier had 30 inspections over the last 24 months. 3 of those resulted in the vehicle being placed out of service for a serious maintenance violation, which results in a 10% out of service rate, which is then compared against the national average for vehicle out of service rates, which is currently 22.26%. And so it goes with vehicles and driver and hazmat. So I found, from my perspective, that's a particularly compelling safety metric that a lot of folks pay attention to. More so than most people realize, because it is so readily available for all fleets, and it's kind of compared against all fleets. It's not like CSA scores where you're put into safety event groups and stuff like that. It is simply telling the reader or the user of that data how frequently are your trucks and drivers having serious safety type violations. And I think that's an important thing to understand, is kind of the distinction between out of service and non out of service violations. Rob, you want to kind of give an overview of the distinction between those two groups of violations?
Well, you've got out of service. It's going to be weighted different than a non out of service, and it's obviously going to take less out of service to increase your score overall, and how it's calculated. But you can look at those violations under SMS. But all of these things kind of fit under what I would call the CSA umbrella of this whole scoring system and violation system. It's kind of all an umbrellaed piece.
They're all pulling from the same databases, really. Whenever your vehicles, if you're an interstate regulated motor carrier, every time one of your commercial vehicles gets stopped for a roadside inspection, all of the violations that are listed out on the reports that you get are filtered into the MICMIS database, Motor Carrier Management information system. And then that system is then pushing the data out to the various the platforms that we're talking about today, one of which is calculating your out-of-service rates. So your out-of-service rates are calculated based on your roadside inspection data, as are your safety management system, CSA scores, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then, it's just slicing and dicing the same data set into different metrics that are saying different things about your fleet. So when I'm looking at a fleet's out-of-service percentages, what I'm taking away from that is the seriousness of the violations that your fleet is incurring. If you've got a bunch of ticky-tack violations that aren't serious, that aren't out-of-service type violations, so form and manner violations are a classic example. If your driver is filling out their driver log and they're forgetting to put the shipper information or that type of stuff, those are form and manner, less serious violations. Those aren't going to lead to your driver being placed out of service. I'm less concerned about fleets that have a high instance of those types of violations than I am of a fleet that has more serious violations where they're being stopped from operating. And how do we know that? We know that based on their out-of-service percentages.
And it kind of goes to that first impression piece, because when you open Safer to look at any of this information, whether it's SMS violations specifically, or whether you're just looking for a rating, the first thing you're actually going to see is the out-of-service rating. So it's that first impression that you initially get hit with. And sometimes it can be overwhelming. And I think, I'm not going to say bias. You can perceive it differently, because if you look at UPS's or another large mega carrier, their out of service rates aren't going to look that bad from a percentage. But if you go down to SMS and look at how many violations they have, or how many fatal crashes, it's going to look a lot worse. But from a percentage aspect, it doesn't look that bad. But if you have 2 trucks in your fleet and you've had 2 out of services, it looks catastrophic. But then you may not have any fatal accidents, and you may not have a lot of violations. But it just ends up giving you that first impression that you're an unsafe, terrible carrier.
No, that's a great point. And it's these are percentages, so they are based on how many inspections you've had. And as Rob said, if you haven't had very many inspections, then one bad inspection is going to seriously impact your out of service percentages. And that's something that I think shippers and brokers don't pay enough attention to. Sometimes we'll have motor carriers come to us and say, hey, I'm not able to get business because shippers and brokers are concerned about my high out of service rates. And I have to help their customers understand that their relatively high out of service percentages in those cases are based on relatively few inspections. So they are not, we argue in those cases, indicative of the carrier's safety management controls. They are just, it's bad luck at that point. You had few inspections and they just happened to inspect trucks or drivers that had a problem. But yeah, it's a key point, is that these are percentages and they can vary based on how many relevant inspections you've had.
Yeah. And that getting chosen is another piece of it. A lot of what I tell people is, especially during road check, is, they pull you over. 31% of roadside inspections are based off what someone visibly sees when you roll through a weigh station or when you're coming down the road. And when they pull you over, if they happen to just get that wrong truck and you have a 2-truck fleet and the other truck happens to be the good truck, it could be ugly. So it goes to that. Make sure your trucks look good. I know some people just look at it like it's a visibility thing, something cosmetic, but the better your trucks look, the less likely they are to get pulled over.
Yeah. And also something else to consider, we kind of talked about this beforehand, Rob, is how difficult it is nowadays to get a clean inspection report. Yeah. Some carriers come to us and ask us what our thoughts are on volunteering to get their trucks inspected to try and drive their out of service percentages down. And so maybe what we talk about is, so that we've talked about what are out of service rates and what data is filtering into them. But the important question is, how do we get control of them? If we look at our out of service rates on our Safer account and we see that they're starting to trend upwards and they're starting to get out of control, particularly with respect to the national average, I found that that's kind of the metric that a lot of the stakeholders are looking at, is how you're comparing to the national average. If you're above the national average, then they're less likely, or you have a bigger target on your back. If they're below the national average, then you're faring a little bit better. But the most important question, obviously, is how do we get control of those scores if they're high? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it kind of let's talk about the first piece first. So I'm kind of funny about sending any trucks for voluntary inspections, but I have done it and I've been successful at it and I failed miserably at it. So I can go either way because you just don't know what you're going to get. For instance, um, we a company that I was managing, we got 200 new vehicles delivered, and obviously I felt that that was a safe bet to ship those brand new, fresh 0 mile trucks through a weigh station because they're fresh, they're brand new. What could be wrong? And obviously that watered down that bad percentage of violations because you now have 200 new violation free inspections that are going to improve the bottom line of your
Yeah.
score.
You're increasing
But
your denominator, I think, is how math works.
yeah, yeah, right. And then but it can go bad. We also had a truck company down in Portsmouth who had one truck, and it was brand new Kenworth. I think this was maybe 2020 model, 2019. They sent it through the weigh station, same idea, and actually got put out of service because it just so happened that year Kenworth studs on the rear tandems had a recall, and two of them were broken. So he got out of service on a brand new truck. So is it ever safe? I don't know that it would ever be safe. I mean, you have equal opportunity for inspection, but I mean, for violation and inspection. But generally, I shy away from it as a general rule. But unless I know it's 100% safe, 98% safe, you know.
And
But
it's also heavily dependent on the inspector, right? Because maybe you got a gunner
yeah, I
who's
mean,
just out of the academy.
I have had other other not brand new, but I had a motor coach deal up in Sonoma County, California, and they that was a different entity that was doing motor coaches. So he gets pulled over, and in the inspection, great inspection. I mean, this coach had less than 10,000 miles on it, but what ultimately happened was they wanted to get a violation, I guess, or they wanted to give the violation. So they found corroded battery cables, and that was the violation. So they go through this whole bus, emergency exits, everything's perfect, and they wrote it up for battery cables. So but it also goes to that, the nickel and dime violations like that. So do I really care about a corroded battery cable to an extreme amount? No.
Yeah.
But if out of service, maybe it would have been a little different. So.
Yeah, I think I'm of the same mind. I think it's too risky in most cases to volunteer for a roadside inspection with the hopes of getting a clean one. But that's really your own. I won't say the only, but it's really the only big way that you improve your out of service rates. It's dependent on your roadside inspections. So as you have the old ones fall off your scores after 24 months and you incur no new ones to take their place, no new out of service violations, that's how your score starts to come down. That's the only way your score comes down. Now, the one caveat to that is data queue system, which I'll save for our discussion of CSA scores, which is coming up next.
Gotcha. Yeah, all right. It's the most expedient. I think anything else is just not. It's all going to be time consuming if you can't get it done that way. And if you're going to try that route, it's important to trust your maintenance department. If you have any questions about your maintenance team, maybe not having them exactly right, I wouldn't do it. So.
Lots of bad things can happen. Not very many good things can happen.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's out of service percentages. Very important safety metric that you understand where you stand as a regulated fleet and work to improve those. Get those below the national average is kind of the name of the game. One last thing I'll mention on hazmat out of service rates specifically. So these are going to be things like placarding violations and shipping paper type violations, stuff where you're hauling hazmat and it's an out of service condition. High hazmat out of service rates can actually impact your credentialing. There's a certain rate that they use for hazmat hazmat out of service rates. It's the national average, where if you exceed the national average for your hazmat out of service rate, you're not going to be able to be qualified to obtain what's called a hazmat safety permit. If you're a hauler of particularly hazardous materials, there are certain types of materials that require what's called a hazmat safety permit from FMCSA. You're not eligible to get that if your hazmat rate exceeds the national average. And if you have a safety permit and your rate escalates above the national average, they're going to strip that away from you. So that's something else to keep in mind. Okay, so that's out of service rates. The next big one are CSA scores. This is kind of the elephant in the room. So Rob, take it away. What are CSA scores? We could spend probably 2 days talking about CSA scores, but from a high level, kind of what are they? And let's just dive right in here.
So essentially, what happens is you get violations, and when you're in the safer system, there's two links at the top. One's going to take you to SMS. One's going to take you to the insurance portal, where you can check on different things like everything from authority registrations and do they have insurance, who their insurance carrier is. But then it also takes you to SMS, which gives you the specific violations that basically make up the scores of these basics. So when we talk about the 7 basic categories, what can happen is these violations are ultimately going to culminate in a percentage. And in that percentage, for instance, maintenance, let's just say their threshold for maintenance, each one has their own maintenance, let's just say 65%. And once you get over 65%, you're going to get this cute little yellow yield triangle over your vehicle maintenance basic that says, hey, there's a problem with this guy in comparison to other carriers that are like him. There's something wrong with his safety management controls that in respect to vehicle maintenance. What's going on with your program? And then from there, that's kind of how they correlate everything. So if you want to go and see why your cute little yellow triangle is over your vehicle maintenance, you can come down to SMS, and then you can select the vehicle summary, and it's going to show you, well, the summary is going to show you the high level, but the inspection history is going to show you, sometimes it's aggravating because you typically only have a license plate or a VIN, and what you're going to end up having to do to figure this out is who drove this vehicle on this day, what office did this belong to, etc. But ultimately, it's going to show you the points that were given and the weight that those points carry. So out of service is obviously weighted heavier against your score than a non-out of service violation. So ultimately, the more out of services you have, and one of the ones that I showed on LinkedIn earlier that I'm kind of in my Friday rant stage about, is they have a huge amount of out of service violations for serious defects over the past 3 or 4 months. And their maintenance score went from like 45% to 67, 68%. So now they have their little cute triangle over their vehicle maintenance. And that's kind of how that whole system works in terms of SMS, how they calculate the score, weighting the scores. And this information, this system, the safer system and the SMS system can give you a lot of data on a carrier's general safety practices and how they rate amongst other carriers like them.
Yeah, so CSA is the primary prioritization tool that the FMCSA uses to escalate motor carriers for enforcement. I've said this on multiple shows before. The FMCSA is a relatively small agency. It does not have the manpower to audit any significant number of motor carriers every year. So it has to, by direction of Congress, it has to have a system in place to push to the top of their audit list the worst performing motor carriers. So how do they do that? They do that through CSA scores. That's what the system is designed to do. It aggregates, as Rob said, all of the data from your roadside inspections over the last 24 months, and it breaks them out into 7 categories known as the basics, which they're displayed here on the screen: unsafe driving, crash indicator, hours of service, vehicle maintenance, controlled substance and alcohol, hazmat, and driver fitness. It puts all of your relevant violations in their categories, and then based on how many of those violations you have in the category, how long ago they occurred, and how serious they were, that's what drives your score in each of these 7 basics. Those are your CSA scores. And as Rob mentioned, they are percentile scores. They are telling how you are performing relative to your peers. who are your peers? The system has a complex methodology. You can find it if you type in SMS methodology. Like I said, this is like a 200-page document. It's available online. But your peers are going to be other motor carriers that have incurred a similar number of inspections with violations in that same category. So if you've had over the last 2 years 10 inspections with unsafe driving violations, then you're going to be compared against other motor carriers that have had a similar number of inspections with unsafe driving violations. So it's not just the size of the carrier that matters. It's how many relevant inspections with violations in each of the categories. And then you're put on a scale. So if there are, depending on how many you have in your safety event group, that's going to drive your percentile score. So if you have, for example, in vehicle maintenance, if you have a score of 92%, higher is not better in this system. 92% means you are performing worse than 92% of your peers in the vehicle maintenance category, and that's bad news. You're going to have one of those warning triangles that Rob mentioned. And so that's the thing to know, is this is a prioritization tool used by FMCSA. The percentile scores are in each of the 7 basics. They are telling you how you're performing relative to your peers. And then as you start to escalate on those scores, each of the individual basics has what's called an intervention threshold. It's set at different levels in each of the basics, and it's a different level for different types of carriers. There's a hazmat intervention threshold, there's a passenger carrier intervention threshold, and there's a property carrier intervention threshold. And it's set somewhere at some level. Rob mentioned 65% for maintenance. Rob, is that the passenger carrier threshold for maintenance?
Yeah.
Because it's 80% for property carriers. So what those thresholds are telling you is that on any given month, if your percentile score exceeds that level, then you are going to get that warning triangle on your score, and that's what you're trying to avoid, because the minute that warning triangle is up, that means you're prioritized for enforcement. Maybe you don't get an audit because of just one warning triangle this month, but it could mean that, particularly in states where law enforcement or FMCSA has more time on their hands. Just one basic in alert status could mean an audit for you. But in other areas where they're particularly busy, maybe they only focus on carriers that have 2 or more basics in that alert status. But that's kind of how it's used by FMCSA.
And I've seen some carriers use this as, hey, we're good. We don't have any yellow triangles, or we don't have a lot of violations. But I've also seen those same carriers be terrible programs. So don't get caught up as much internally with this thing, because it just means you could have a terrible program and you're just waiting to get caught. You haven't yet. So I still encourage people to not put as much emphasis internally from a company from a company aspect when we're talking about corrective action measures, but just be proactive about your programs overall. Yeah. One of those proactive pieces is checking your SMS scores regularly. I check when I'm running a company. I usually check them every 30 days, because just because a driver gets one doesn't mean they're going to tell you about it. So you need to check those constantly to find out, did any of my drivers get violations that they haven't told us about? So focus on it, but only focus on it in respect that you have other internal focuses of your own corrective action measures. Yeah. So
what I think is most valuable about SMS, particularly for fleets that have a lot of roadside activity where there's more data in this system, I like to use SMS as an early warning system. I like to look for trends in the carrier's data. Are they starting to incur a lot more hours of service violations? And I like to use that as, like I said, early warning. Hey, you're starting to see your hours of service score trend upwards, so it's time to focus your attention on that. It's time for your safety team to get control of that so that you can start to see the curve going down in the right direction. It's very valuable in my estimation, in my opinion, to identify negative trends in your compliance, because it covers a wide range of areas of compliance, and then to buck those trends before they blow up into a warning triangle or into a serious accident or into high out of service rates. Like Rob said, I like to look at these on a monthly basis. I'm looking at them. I'm looking at what the scores are, but I'm diving even deeper than that. Don't just stop at the scores. Like Rob said, sometimes the scores themselves aren't all that valuable. It's what's underlying the scores. So you got to go down. So we're showing here on the screen. This is a carrier's SMS account. This is the public version of the account. We should mention that CSA scores, those percentile scores, and the warning triangles that go along with them, used to be publicly available for all motor carriers, but they were taken down from public view probably 10 years ago now, at the direction of Congress for reasons we're not going to get into here, for property carriers, any non-passenger carrier. So now, if you're looking up a property carrier, all you can see are the kind of the data that underlies their SMS scores. You're not going to be able to see what their percentile scores are unless you happen to be that motor carrier, and you can log into your account and see what your CSA scores are. But the point is, what I like to do, besides just focusing my attention on the CSA scores themselves, is look at the underlying data. So I can click into any one of these categories. If I've got a high score in maintenance, for example, I'm going to go into maintenance. I'm going to scroll down, and I'm going to look at, like Rob said, what violations with maintenance violations are contributing to my relatively high score. The system lists out every single violation that is contributing to that score, and I can get a sense of what drivers are causing the problem, what vehicles are causing the problem, what types of issues are most common to my fleet. Do I have a lot of lighting violations? Do I have a lot of tire violations? That gives me the ammunition I need to then take it the next step and get control of those. If I have a lot of those brake lights and tires violations, for example, then the problem is probably drivers not doing thorough enough pre-trip inspections, because those types of things should be caught in a pre-trip inspection in most cases. And so that's the kind of information I need to be armed with as a safety team to then go get control of that, start holding my drivers accountable to more thorough pre-trip inspections, give them additional training if that's what's needed, and then start to watch my old violations fall off and my scores start to improve. That's the way you get control of these things.
Yeah, and this is going to help you keep the pulse on your compliance trends and your violation trends. And like he said, if you've got a lot of these real micro roadside violations like lighting and fire extinguishers, it's driver inspections is your problem. Or you may have a more systemic issue where if you've got brakes out of adjustment, axle out of alignment, serious issues that maybe a driver wouldn't have been able to catch during an inspection, but it more targets, it's more trending towards a systemic issue on your maintenance team versus a driver inspections. Or you could have both. You could have a lot of lights, a lot of extinguishers, a lot of bad tires, and your systemic issues. So it's helping you keep that pulse on it. That's going to help you improve it if you keep track of those trends and what's making it ugly.
Yeah, that's the thing carriers don't want to hear, is what it takes to fix these scores. So many of them want to hear that there's a quick fix to this, but as I've said over and over, and I know you say this, Rob, there's no quick fix. It is recognizing patterns of noncompliance and then putting in the work to buck those trends. And that often involves holding drivers accountable, investing in training, investing in spending time with them and walking them through how to do a proper pre-trip inspection. All of that stuff is what it takes to get control of these scores, and it's not fast either. That if that's the way you're fixing the scores, it is going to take time for the old violations to fall off your score or reduce in weight. They reduce in weight as they become older, and for you to incur no new violations to take their place. That is the way you get control of your CSA scores. And like I said, it takes work, takes time, takes effort. There is one other way, and that's the data queue system. Rob, we've blown through the time here already, but let's spend a little time talking about data queue. Maybe give your 1-minute synopsis of data queue and how that works to kind of improve your CSA scores.
Well, if you have a legitimate reason to argue a violation or the preventability of an accident, whether it was preventable or not, and you want to make that argument, then you can use the data queue system to argue, basically appeal the violation. And then it kind of has this hierarchy level where it's going to flow to the entity that gave you the violation to start with. And then you can kind of flow it up the hierarchy from there to argue your case. But if it's a frivolous argument and you are really in violation, it's not recommended to waste your time, because I can tell you it's probably not going to go anywhere. But if it is a legitimate argument that you have to kill the violation, then they'll agree with you. They're a pretty fair process.
Sometimes. But you better be sure you've got some evidence to back up your case, because
Yeah.
what I've found, to Rob's point, even just aside from frivolous arguments, what I've found is that if it's going to be a violation that comes down to your driver's word versus the officer's word, you're going to lose that battle 99% of the time. So I usually like to only focus my attention on violations where I've got some type of evidence to back up my case, whether it be in the form of like video, camera evidence to show that the officer clearly got something wrong is a good example, or other situations where you've got some documentary evidence to back up your case and where the officer can't really dispute what it is that you're showing. Those are the ones you're going to have the best chance of success in getting those violations either removed from your score, or in the case of like adjudicated citations, if you've got a violation where your driver got the violation but also got a state citation, a ticket for that same issue, and then they go and litigate that ticket through their state court system, if they can get the court to dismiss that violation or that citation, or change it to a different violation altogether, then there's an option in the data queue system called the adjudicated citation option, where you can go in and provide the court documentation. If the court dismissed it, then on the FMCSA side of things, on the data queue side of things, the state no longer has any discretion. They have to remove that from your scores. Same thing, kind of, if the court changes the violation to something else than what was cited. You'll see this pretty commonly. For whatever reason, courts or state prosecutors are inclined to change violations to something entirely different than what they were cited for. Maybe the driver was cited for speeding and they end up with a parking ticket or something stupid like that. If you can provide evidence in the data queue system that your driver was, through the adjudicated citation, was ultimately convicted of a different charge, then that will reduce the violation on your CSA score down to a severity weight of 1. We didn't even really talk about severity weights. There's a scoring system that dictates how heavily weighted each of these violations are. I think there's like 1,000 violations in the system, and they all have their own severity weight, and they're all published in that SMS methodology. But that also dictates how weighty these violations are on your score. We don't have time to talk about that today. We've got another video, another episode of Trucksafe Live, actually, that we did a few months ago. FMCSA is actually proposing some changes to how the scoring system works. If you're interested in more granular details of how SMS works and what those proposed changes are and how they may impact your CSA scores, go back and watch our episode a few months ago where we spent a lot of time diving into SMS methodology and what might be changing. We are out of time, Rob. We can't leave the show without at least mentioning what ISS scores are, what they mean. I think we can dispose of that pretty quickly. Do you want to run through ISS real quickly?
Say that one more time, Brandon.
I'm going to run through a couple minutes on ISS, just what ISS, Inspection Selection System, is and what it means.
Yeah, so basically, when it's kind of the best way to explain it is when you're going to a weigh station, they run your numbers and you're given a score of 1 to 100, and if you are priority, you're probably going to get pulled over, or you can fall in the mid range, you're going to get optional pullover, or on the low range that you can get passed, basically. So that's kind of how that is. You're a priority for a roadside inspection, or you're not.
It dictates how frequently your trucks or buses are going to get pulled over for roadside inspection on that scale of 1 to 100. And how do you get those scores? They are dictated primarily by your CSA scores. So carriers that have one of their basics in alert status with that orange triangle, they're going to have a higher ISS score, Inspection Selection System score, than a carrier that doesn't have any basics in alert status, for example. And then the last thing I'll mention about ISS scores is that there's also what's called an insufficient data algorithm, where motor carriers that don't have much inspection activity at all are going to have a higher ISS score than motor carriers that do. The idea being that if you're a carrier that doesn't have much inspection data, we want to get your trucks in more frequently so that we have more data in the system and the data is more reliable in terms of what it's saying about your fleet. So how do you improve ISS scores? You improve ISS scores by improving your CSA scores. So the same things that Rob and I just spent some time talking about. All right. So sorry for kind of rushing that there. We had a lot to go through, and we got to a lot, but there's a lot more that goes into it. So we're gonna wrap it up there, Rob. Thanks again for joining me. Where can people find you if they have more questions for you, or they wanna get you to help out with their fleet?
Carpentercompliance.com, and you'll find all my contact information in there. And if we can help you, we'll help you. If not, we'll send you to Brandon.
All right. Thanks again, Rob. Really appreciate you joining me. Thanks everybody for tuning in today. One thing that I should mention is that we have a very detailed webinar on this type of safety metrics specifically. If you're interested, that's available to all members of the Trucksafe Compliance Network. If you join today, like I said, free to join. If you go in there today, you'll find one of our previous webinars where we spent like an hour and a half talking about all of this stuff. So that's available to you. Also, check out our online courses for safety managers and for drivers over at trucksafeacademy.com. We have online courses where safety managers can work through all of this type of DOT compliance stuff, including safety metrics, but also the nitty gritty of driver qualification, hours of service, etc. Check that out if you're interested. Trucksafeacademy.com. Stay tuned to whatever we've got going on, including announcements about future shows over on our social media pages, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter. We're pretty active on all of those. And then just stay tuned for our next Trucksafe Live episode. Thank you for being here with us. Thanks again to the sponsor of this season of Trucksafe Live, which is Log Rock. We will see everyone later. Thanks for joining us.